Evening, everyone. This is kind of part two of Building a Better Future. Part one was when Craig was across in the freezing wastes of the United States, of Boston. Part two, he's back. And welcome, Craig. Welcome, Diana. Take it away. Inflation, building a better future.
Thank you. Before I start, last time around there were some sound challenges, so I just want to make sure I'm coming through loud and clear. Fantastic. Hello, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Craig Renney. I'm the Economist and Director of Policy in the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions. Prior to holding that glamorous job, I was Grant Robertson's Economic Advisor for 5 years. Prior to that, I worked at the Treasury and at the Reserve Bank, so you can literally blame me for everything. In terms of inflation, the economy, anything else that's gone wrong over the past 5 years, I've probably got something to do with the blame. Thank you all very much for coming tonight and putting through the second half of this story. And the first time we came to you, we talked to you about building a better future, our alternative economic strategy. And in a box over there should be copies of the thing that we want to talk to you tonight about, which is our proposal for an Inflation and Incomes Act. Now, in part, this has been inspired by the work which we've seen done in the US through Biden, through his Inflation Reduction Act. But also the work that we've seen internationally as well. And there's a real sea change as someone who's just come from the US, come from the UK, a real sea change about how politicians and others really are addressing and viewing inflation, but also thinking about the economy generally and thinking about the role of the state. And we think there's a real turning point, a real opportunity to really think differently about how we do that and how we manage both inflation and our economic growth in the future. So today we want to talk to you about what kind of country and economy you want to have and why that's actually important right now. So why is that important? Because things have changed. It's hard to do this without sounding like a giant humble brag, but I went to Harvard on January the 5th, and I came back at the end of February, and stuff had changed. We lost the Prime Minister in between. If anybody forgets, we had a giant flooding event in Auckland, which we seem to have glossed over, which is going to cost about $2 billion to fix. We then had a cyclone, which is going to cost about $13 billion to fix. And we had a 6.2 earthquake, which thankfully cost no damage. But sort of, with things have gone and changed, the entire country's changed. The polls have changed. And so we had the resignation of Jacinda, and we've got a new Prime Minister in Chris Hippins and Deputy Prime Minister in Carmel Sepuloni. We've seen, huge climate change events, and that's on top of the existing $210 billion infrastructure gap we have in the country through the Infrastructure Commission's reports. And that's, there's roads, schools, hospitals, drainage that should exist, and that doesn't right now. We've got a cost of living crisis, which we thought would be going away by now, but isn't. Inflation's still 7.2%, down from 7.3%. Whoop-de-doo. So inflation, doesn't mean anything's getting cheaper. It just means it's rising ever so slightly, less quickly. And that's still causing the Reserve Bank to increase interest rates, despite our best efforts to tell them not to. And the impact of the cyclone and the rebuild will probably make that inflation worse. And we need to ask ourselves the question, if it's going to make it worse, is continuing to increase the interest rate the thing that we need to do? We've also got a bunch of domestic challenges that, despite these short-term challenges, still exist. We still have many tens of thousands of units housing short in New Zealand. We still have health problems. We still have water problems. We still have giant economic insecurity problems in this country. And they're still here, despite the fact that the media attention has gone away from them, because we're tackling other issues right now. And they're still really important, and we still need to get on with them. And globally, things are marginally getting better, but the war in Ukraine turned one the other day. Oil prices, grain prices, food prices, they've all come down from last year, but in comparison to 3 years ago, they're all still really elevated. And as a consequence, globally, the situation's not likely to get any better anytime soon. And so as a consequence, globally, we need to think about, there are global issues, there are domestic issues, there's a cost of living crisis. the kaleidoscope has changed. The thing that's changed, the thing that's made the difference here is actually we now have new political leadership and we've got new opportunity. And because we're seeing that change globally as well, it's not just that which is happening in New Zealand, it's that which is happening in the US, in the UK and elsewhere. And so we're asking ourselves the question, what can we do differently? How can we build back that thing differently? And, for us in the CTU, the really important chart that we put up at this point in time that I've put up, every audience I've gone to in the US or the UK or elsewhere, labour productivity growth is still being massively outstretched in terms of wage growth. So workers are getting less and less of the economy. We're seeing more and more of the pie going to capital and to shareholders, and yet inflation is dragging that real wage growth even further south right now for many workers. So we're not seeing over 30 years the benefits of work go to workers or to workforces, and nothing in the mix of policies that we have right now is going to help tackle that in the long run. It's going to help tackle that over a significant enough period of time to make a real dent in that jaws of death. And frankly, we did this in Harvard, and you can draw that same diagram for the US. You can draw that same diagram for Australia. You can draw that same diagram for the UK. Real productivity growth is outstripping wage growth in all of those countries and has done for a significant period of time. And so, again, not just that which is happening in New Zealand, how do we tackle inflation and incomes in a coherent way together to actually, give something back to the workers and the workforce? So, we have a challenge. And the question for us is, we have a cyclone rebuild, $13 billion estimated by the Minister of Finance. It's likely to be much more once we've got, the real information in. We found that during Christchurch when the bill kept going up and up and up. We've got a cost of living crisis, which means that we need to pay more and more just to stand still, but also we've got more need. Demographics and population aren't changing. They're continuing to rise, and so they're continuing to build need. And we've got a budget which is this big. And so what's going to have to give? What's going to have to change if you're going to continue to live by the existing financial rules that we have? And so we've got an election year budget in May, when traditionally we expect to see some kind of giveaway, we expect to see some kind of thing. We have an election in October. The political polling is changing. 2 months ago, I would have given you 3-1 for the Labour Party to get back in. Now, it's pretty much, I'd say it's odds even, to be deadly honest. And, the extent to which that continues will be a function of how we tackle that problem and how we tackle that problem. As we talked about globally, this language is changing around the role of government and the role and the need for infrastructure investment. And there's a greater acceptance of the need for reform as a consequences of the natural disasters that we've had. I think we all accept, or at least the majority of people accept, that we can't just simply build back the things that were there. We can't just simply build back the roads and the houses and the other things that were there just as they were before, because if we do so, we're going to buy the same problem again in 10 years' time. So how do we, to use the phrase of Minister Hipkins, how do we build back better? How do we do that in a way where we're actually genuinely doing that, where we're tackling our long-term economic development desires and our long-term economic growth desires, and tackling our short-term needs to rebuild in the country? And so for us, and then the first line in the report, for us, the definitive history of the current government is yet to be written, but when it is, it will be a story of crisis management. The sixth Labour government has managed March 15th for Carly White Island, COVID-19, and it's profoundly affected everybody here. To that, we've now got to add a major flooding event and a cyclone. So when we think about this government, it is a government responding to natural disasters, 1 in 100-year events that seem to happen once a year, once in every 1 in 100 years. And those crises were dealt with via a mix of government action, public support. Can you remember when we were all a team of 5 million? When we got leadership through adversity, better outcomes for New Zealanders were forged. And we realised that we were no longer just passive players in a market. We were actually active participants in the economy. And if we chose to do something, we could. And so we need to carry that forward. We need to make sure that we're actually, again, active participants in deciding what kind of economy we want to be in the future and what kind of country we want to be in the future. So for us, we've got a choice. And there's some clear choices ahead of us at the election and elsewhere. So do we want to be country A? Do we want to be a country where we've got higher levels of investment and a stronger public service? Do we want to be country A where we're building that more resilient economy based upon value, not volume, where we stop being the Saudi Arabia of milk, which is what we are? Do we want to stop? We're the second largest exporter of raw timber in the world. Think about it. We're a tiny set of islands in the south of the Pacific. We're the second largest exporter of raw timber in the world. 2/3 of all of our timber ends up on the banks of the Yangtze, where it turns into wood chip and then gets turned into furniture and sold back to us. Yeah. We need to move away from that particular economic model. Well, we need to prioritize outcomes for workers and their families as actually a part of our economic development agenda and our economic growth agenda. And we see an essential role for the state as an enabler of economic development, rather than just being someone who removes roadblocks and gets out of the way, but actually acts as a catalyst for economic development. Or we can be country B. And we've seen country B because this has been the roadmap for the past 30 years, where we've reduced the role of the state and we've brought in third parties, despite criticism of consultants, in terms of delivering more services, where we've used taxation, and in particular the reduction in taxation, as a means of stimulating the economy and stimulating growth, where we've seen prioritizing business growth over well-being. And we've put business needs ahead of well-being needs for the country. That's why you can't walk into the rivers in Canterbury, because they've been turned into rivers of nitrate rather than being the clean, braided rivers they were before. And we've seen growth delivered on reducing regulation, increasing market flexibility, and if you take nothing else away, about increasing economic insecurity. We've built our growth model over the past 30, 40 years on increasing the insecurity of workers and increasing the insecurity of communities. And that's how we've developed growth. And so what kind of country do we want to be? Do we want to be country A, or do we want to be country B? Now, to me, it's a really clear, option, and I put it in a slightly twisted way here. But for me, and I think most of the people in this room, although, I appreciate we're in 6011, so we've got to be slightly careful about the rest of the country, but we want to be country A, and we need to move towards country A. But to do so, we need to make a decision to do that. We need to, because everything else is taking us, and all the rest of our current policy settings are driving us towards country B. And that's certainly where some of us would like us to return post-COVID. So hopefully the CTUs come to the rescue with what we hope together is we've pulled together an Inflation and Incomes Act. And we've pulled this together because we seek three things for New Zealand as part of this act. We want to change the conversation around how we address inflation. Inflation's a problem. Let's not pretend. Inflation is real, and inflation causes pain. It does, right? But the solution to many of our inflation problems is investment, is actually choosing to make a decision, is actually choosing to make change. Investment is our friend in this space. It's actually not our enemy. And to tackle our over-reliance upon the use of the official cash rate and monetary policy as a tool of delivering that inflation change. For us, many of the levers of change, especially long-term change, the kinds of change that's going to really deliver long-term for low and middle-income households in New Zealand, those don't lie in monetary policy. Those lie in fiscal policy. Those lie in government investment. Those lie elsewhere. But instead, we use one lever. And we shouldn't. We should stop our over-reliance on that official cash rate. And to offer a new suite of government investments and government programs to help deliver that inflation, not just now, but over the long run. Because we know that low-income workers and beneficiaries have been disproportionately impacted by inflation. And if we genuinely cared about inflation, we didn't care about inflation not just now when it's high, because middle-class people like me start to be affected, and I can choose to trade down to the second layer of brie at More Wilson's. I mean, I wouldn't recommend it, but you can do. But we should care about inflation when it impacts low-income workers without choices. And that's been happening for the past 10 years. That hasn't just been happening now. So we should really care about it now and in the future. And so we need to start a better conversation about inflation in New Zealand. One based upon delivering the economy that we want, and not just dealing with the economy that we have. How we get to country A, and how we get to that good place, because that's based upon having a plan. And right now, what we don't have is a plan. We don't even have a sense of what actually good looks like from the government in terms of the economy. We've got some broad statements, but we don't have a sense of what good looks like. And without that, we can't plan to get there, and we can't plan to get to country A. And so, again, if you want evidence of this, and this is an audience that loves nothing else if it loves evidence, is this red line represents the inflation rate for the wealthiest 20% of households in New Zealand since 2008. And the blue line represents the inflation rate for the poorest 20% of households since 2008. And as you can see, it's about 25, so it's about 15 basis points higher across the period. What does that mean? For those with the very lowest incomes and no choices, they've faced higher and higher inflation year after year after year. And why have they faced that inflation? Because core inflation has been higher. Food, fuel, rent, rates, things you can't escape. Whereas the price of mobile phones, the price of telephony, the price of other things, they've actually got cheaper. So if you've got choices, your inflation rate has often been lower. And we should really care about inflation when it impacts those without choices, rather than just caring about it when it impacts people like me who have choices. So you can read the document online. The document's available at buildingabetterfuture.org.nz. And there's copies at the back of the room. But the CTU believes that if we're to tackle that cause of interlinked inflation, of rebuilding and the cost of living problem, we need a long-term plan. And the lack of it is actually what's driving many of our current problems. And then the best way to achieve that long-term plan is actually to deliver one. Is actually just to get out and do it, and actually to do that work, because right now we're not. So we're calling for an Inflation and Incomes Act. And the first thing that we're calling for is the act would require the government, not just the Reserve Bank, but the government, to tackle core inflation. And core inflation for us is food, fuel, rent. It's actually the HLP, the Household Living Price Index, for the poorest 20% of households. And to stabilize that inflation rate over 10 years. So that actually, it's not just the poorest who are facing higher inflation rates than everybody else. And the reason we want the government to do that is because this is about supply, not demand. This is about making sure that actually we're putting the supply of rents, of rental properties up. We're making sure that there's competition in food markets. We're making sure that there's enough income through minimum wage and other changes that people can afford to live. So this is about targeting core inflation and putting that on the government's agenda and making it responsible, rather than just forcing it onto the Reserve Bank, who then only has one lever to tackle that problem, which is the OCR. The Act will have a particular focus on rents, with the aim of ensuring that the median rent in New Zealand is no more than 30% of the median household income. Why is that number important? Because that's the international number for housing stress. Now, it has to be, and there's someone in the room who knows infinitely more about this than me, and I wouldn't pretend to know as much, but we're nowhere near that number. And so we want to have that as our target, and so we need to know how to get there, and we want to make that the government's responsibility in the same way it does for child poverty and for the reduction in child poverty numbers. We want to make sure that the Act will require the government to set targets to increase the disposable income of New Zealanders over time. And those targets could include targets aimed at lowering the cost of housing, reducing the cost barriers to essential services. So, for example, my good friend Max Rashbrook has recently done some work on the barriers to access for medical services. For every dollar invested in reducing the barriers to access for medical services, $4 are saved on the other side by the Crown. So why don't we do that? And so we need to create situations in which we can allow the reduction of cost barriers to essential services, and we believe that we can do that by creating a more equitable taxation system. We want to talk a little bit about that during this presentation. But importantly for us, the government will be required under the Act to show that its policies contribute both to its overall economic strategy, so it's working not against itself but for itself, and that its policies and targets are working to help reduce child poverty as part of its overall aim. The government demonstrated how these targets and its policies are also going to have an impact on unemployment and unemployment levels. Because what we can't do is simply just tackle these problems as we do with the OCR by lifting 70,000 people into unemployment. If that's the solution to current inflation, we need a better answer to that question. So for us, the government should be demonstrating these things at budget, that its policies are actually working towards its overall aims, that it's actually working towards reducing child poverty, and that it's working to reduce unemployment. Because right now, the proportion of income spent for rent for an average worker is now 48% of their income. And that's gone up since 2009 from 36%. So if you want to know who's winning in terms of the income wars, if you want to know where the money's going, you're working harder and harder, you're working longer and longer, and more of it's going on rent. Every year, relentlessly, it goes up and up and up. So we've got a bunch of proposals to help tackle these problems, to help put this together. This won't be, we want to talk to you about these things. We actually want to hear what you have to say. This won't be an exhaustive list. This won't be the exact list of things that will work, but we want to start that conversation. We want to start the conversation about how do we put the government in the center of the role of tackling both inflation and incomes, not just now, but over the long run. And in doing so, change the nature of the inflation conversation. So we believe that the Act should require the delivery of policies to ensure that New Zealand's economy is more productive, sustainable, and inclusive. One that is capable of growing in a way that tackles our long-term economic problems whilst delivering durable improvements to New Zealanders' well-being. And it will invest to provide a country that is not only the best place to be a child. That's what the Prime Minister used to say when it was Jacinda Ardern, used to say was her calling into politics. She wanted to make New Zealand the best country in the world to be a child. According to the World Bank, we are already the best country in the world to be a business. It's always us or Singapore. And the only reason we're not light years ahead of Singapore is because we're 41st in the world for getting an electrical connection to your factory. If it wasn't for the fact that it was really difficult to get an electrical connection to your factory, we'd be light years ahead of Singapore. So the Prime Minister used to want us to be the best country in the world to be a child. We are already the best country in the world to be a business. For us at the CTU, we want New Zealand to be the best country in the world to be a worker. Because we don't think you can deliver that without this being the best country in the world to be a worker. Because if you can deliver the best country in the world to be a worker, you're delivering the best country in the world to have communities, to have families, to have people together, because you can't deliver one without the other. So let's balance that. And we've got a bunch of policies that we want to help deliver on some of these areas. So for example, for us, we want to close Huntly Power Station. And the reason we want to close Huntly Power Station is because it's the last coal-burning power station in the country. We import Indonesian coal for the pleasure of doing that. And actually, Huntly Power Station staying on keeps energy prices higher than they otherwise would. Because Huntly costs more per hour to operate. Because it's the last hour of energy that drives the energy price. Everyone whose energy is cheaper gets that Huntly energy price. So it just creates a margin for everybody else in the energy industry. If we closed that and actually said, let's move to a situation where we had fully renewable energy across the country, we would not only close Huntly, we would actually make energy cheaper. But we want to do that via a just transition in that space. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And again, planning and kickstarting a just transition to a fully electrified public transport fleet, together with a more equitable public transport funding mechanism. Now, we, at the start of the cost of living crisis, we made public transport half price. And one of the things that was slightly astonishing in making public transport half price is that we realized how cheap it was to make public transport half price. It's $320 million a year to make public transport free in New Zealand. But it's nearly $1 billion to knock 25 cents off a litre of fuel. This is not a difficult equation. We should just be making public transport free, or at least much more equitably funded across the country. Because right now, we're spending a lot of money to take a little bit of a cost off a litre of fuel, and we're not spending a lot of money to actually make public transport much more available for a lot of people. So we want to be looking at that and saying, how do we do that? We want to progressively bring the energy generators back into public ownership. We know from the Generating Scarcity report, which is also produced with First Union and the CTU, that the energy generators have been generating huge dividends for shareholders, well in excess of the profits that they've actually made. But energy generation over the past 10 years has remained exactly the same. In fact, we use more fossil fuels in terms of coal and diesel than we did 10 years ago. So at the same time as we've made giant profits in the sector for shareholders, generations remain the same, and actually the proportion of that generation which is carbon or fossil fuel generated has remained exactly the same. We want to deliver a levy on the larger banks to ensure that bank profits in New Zealand stay here and contribute to our economic development. Every New Zealander pays around $2,000 a year just to the profits of the big banks in New Zealand. Why? They deliver a service. They deliver a service more expensively than the major other banks around the rest of the world. And we want to make sure that actually we can use some of that bank profit to help deliver some of the infrastructure needs that we know that they actually benefit from, because we systematically de-risk their investments through government investment. So we want to help recycle some of that bank profit to help deliver some of the development that they need so that they can continue to make profits in the country. And we want to ensure a fairer and more progressive taxation system by creating a tax-free threshold in New Zealand. Again, this will be revenue neutral, paid for via a tax switch from those on very low incomes or those on medium incomes towards those with much higher marginal tax rates, together with alternative forms of taxation. So one of the things we're very keen on doing is exploring the option of making sure how can we put some money back into the pockets of those on very low and middle income earners, but do so in a way that doesn't just simply rob the Crown of its ability to continue to make the investments that we know are essential. The $210 billion investment gap that we know exists before Cyclone Gabrielle that needs to be filled over the next a few years. Otherwise, we're just passing that cost on to our kids and their kids and their kids. And as if you wanted proof, these are our annual coal imports from the past few years. And again, from 2012, every year we've increased in petajoules, if you want to know what that chart's actually demonstrating, the value of our coal imports in terms of energy since 2012. And again, for the next year, that picture will get worse.
So one of the other things we want to do is is this working? Yeah. Increase the disposable incomes and ensure working people see more reward from the value they help create in the economy. Because what we have seen is real incomes declining over the last decade. Despite New Zealand having one of the second highest minimum wages, we actually have one of the lowest average wages among our peers, including the UK, USA, Australia, Canada and Ireland. A minimum wage worker today works 6 hours longer to pay rent than they did a decade ago for the same property. This time last year, mean rents in Wellington had 97% of a minimum worker's take-home pay. And as Craig was saying earlier, the international standard of when someone goes into housing stress is 30%, so we are well in stress. Therefore, we think it's a no-brainer to make the minimum wage the living wage, and we suggest setting the rate in the future via a tripartite process involving business, unions and governments. Our Act also recommends that contractors are covered through fair pay agreements and expanding coverage so that minimum terms and conditions are prevalent well across the economy. That we also reduce the burden of student debt repayments by making the scheme more progressive, like what they have in Australia. Currently, the student loan borrowers repay 12% of every dollar earned over the threshold, which basically this means that the real income tax rate of someone on 70k is 45%. However, in comparison, the wealthiest income earners in New Zealand pay only 39% for the top tax rate. So we also recommend introducing a first-time buyer mortgage product with a fixed interest rate for 25 years on Crown-built new properties. A new state advance loan would see mortgage holders benefit from stability of repayments, and this would also create a pipeline of demand for new Crown construction.
So as we discussed earlier, we also proposed lowering the barrier to access for national health services, for GPs, for pharmac, for dental care, further expanding support and access to effective and culturally appropriate mental health services, with the goal of making access to mental health services as simple as accessing your local GP, or hopefully better than accessing your local GP right now if you live in Wellington and you're trying to get a GP's appointment, which sometimes takes weeks. One of the things we also want to see is further extending the free or low-cost school meals programme. If there was ever a reason to be in government, feeding kids in schools seems like one of the most obvious things possibly imaginable. I can't imagine the downsides of making sure that kids get a hot meal in the day. Yes, some children might benefit who might otherwise be able to pay for it, but it seems a small price to pay. And when we live in a country where there's 125,000 children who live in material poverty, that means that they may well not get 2 hot meals a day on the official deprivation 17 index. It's one of the key indicators. If that's the case, we're a wealthy country. We can afford to make sure that each kid in school gets a hot meal a day, at least once a school day.
So this Act also aims to provide an enduring solution to New Zealand's housing crisis by making housing more affordable to build, rent and own. In 2020, the United Nations, talking about New Zealand's housing crisis, said that at the root of this problem is a speculative housing market that has been supported by successive governments who have promoted home ownership as an investment while until recently discontinuing the provision of social housing and providing inadequate tenant protection. If you want to see this in action, roughly 30% of New Zealand households rent, and they're twice as likely to live in cold, damp and mouldy housing as homeowners. We have a housing wait list, over 26,000 despite record numbers of state housing being built. Over 10,000 permanent state houses have been added since October 2017 when the Labour government was sworn in, making this the largest government contribution to the state housing building program since World War II. However, when the Ministry of Works was building our housing, we could build 10,000 a year. It's time for an alternative approach, one that increases our capacity to build our infrastructure for needs for the future as well as train and retain our staff. Therefore, the Act proposes reinvesting in the state's capacity to build at scale, and this would also reduce the long-run costs of building housing infrastructure and provide an enduring solution to our housing shortage. It's also time for a comprehensive capital gains tax, excluding the family home, to reshape the incentives to ensure housing is seen as first and foremost a place to live and where warm, dry, affordable housing is normal in New Zealand rather than a rarity. That we address supply chain blockages in building materials for construction. This would encourage new entrants into the market and adopting comparable overseas quality control marks. We also would like to expand and regulate off-site manufacturing and improve access to appropriate overseas products, and this would lead to increased construction quality and productivity. And
I find it sort of slightly astonishing. Sort of the just this year we saw last year we saw jib prices rocket. We saw building material prices rocket. We saw timber prices rocket, despite being one of the largest producers of raw wood in the world. And it was kind of, it's funny, so we saw, Auckland's major criminals having to choose between whether to store meth in warehouses or jib, depending on which was most lucrative as a particular option. But so for us, our inflation response should help to address those supply chain issues, because if we don't, we're simply storing those inflation problems back up for the future. And so we want to see the creation of good, new, green, sustainable jobs, encouraging the adoption of skills necessary for the new green economy, and for rebuilding through the greater use of active labour market programmes in New Zealand. New Zealand's one of the lowest spenders on active labour market programmes anywhere in the OECD. Now, my colleagues at the Treasury will tell you that this is a definitional issue, is that we're just defining what is an active labour market programme wrongly in New Zealand. According to the Treasury, active labour market programmes also include things like paid parental leave, also include things like the leave subsidy scheme, which subsidy scheme that we had in New Zealand. That's an active labour market programme. It's not an active labour market programme, nor is paid parental leave an active labour market programme. We need to do much more in this space, and we should do so via the new and existing Just Transitions partnerships that exist in New Zealand. We have one in Southland for TY. We have one in Taranaki. We should have one in Northland for Marsden Point. But we need to be using those and expanding new ones to help deliver the kinds of just transitions that we want to see across the country. And we probably should have a Just Transitions partnership in the areas that have been most affected by Cyclone Gabrielle, to make sure as we're rebuilding in those areas, we're actually rebuilding the skills and the jobs that are not only going to be there in the short run, but are going to be there in the long run, are needed in the long run. And one of the things, and this has become political, we wrote this before recent events. One of the things we really want to see is the providing high quality, publicly provided early childhood education, provided progressively over the next 10 years. And the reason we want to do that is quite straightforward. ECE in Wellington is a middle class pursuit. ECE around the rest of the country, one of the biggest barriers is not actually paying, it's actually just access. It's actually just getting a space. And we want to be delivering that. And we don't believe we should be using ECE in early childhood education as a means of driving profit. We should be using ECE as a means of delivering better outcomes for some of the very poorest children we have, the very youngest children we have in the country. There have been 2 Nobel Prizes won for delivering services at early stages in children's lives. And the better outcomes we get from that, we shouldn't profit from that. We should be delivering it as a service. And so it comes to the fun bit, which is the money bit. And so we believe to do that, we need to actually deliver a new fiscal approach. Because without it, we're just going to be constrained by the existing fiscal position that we have right now. And our current economic and inflation challenges, we argue, are actually compounded by our fiscal system, which encourages the short-term focus on stability, rather than concentrating in an overly conservative position on debt. There is no debt crisis in New Zealand. Debt, last set of budget forecasts, debt was 17.2% of GDP on a net debt basis, and falling to 14.1% by 2027 in the end of the period. The government's own self-imposed debt ceiling is 30% of GDP. Even with Gabriel, we're not likely to hit that debt ceiling anytime soon. And that debt ceiling would put us nowhere near our international competitors. If we were having this conversation in the UK, net debt would be 100% of GDP. Having this conversation in the US, net debt would be somewhere in the order of 110% of GDP. Having this conversation in Japan, net debt's 270% of GDP. So we're nowhere near that particular level, and there's not the debt crisis that we permanently behave as if it's just round the corner in New Zealand. So we believe we should be increasing the government's capital spending allowance consistent with keeping net core crown debt sustainable. And sustainable is different to a debt ceiling. Sustainable is about the ability to repay. It's actually not about how much money you've borrowed. We should provide greater clarity on the expected demands of our economy and on public services. the expected costs and liabilities for health, education and transport over a 10-year time frame. So we can actually work out how much we need to spend on health and education and housing. One of the things I was astonished to discover when we came to government was actually in many areas we had no idea how much money we needed to spend just to actually stand still. How much money the health service needed in order just to keep services as they were, never mind to improve or to fill demographic and population change in the future. We have no idea of the liability, as we call it. And so we want to make sure that we're actually measuring the liability. So when we're offered the chance of a tax cut, when we're offered the chance of cutting services, we can actually really provide that value for money trade-off. We can actually genuinely understand, would you rather have that money back? Or actually, are we just creating a liability that we're pushing into the future? We want to kickstart our investment needs through a one-off windfall tax on those companies who've done really well during COVID. And we can point to those, be it in the supermarkets where the Competition Commission found that they're making $1 million a day in excess profits above the normal level of profits. And energy companies and others that we know have done really well during COVID. And most importantly, we want to create a new value for money approach. There's nothing right-wing about value for money. In fact, one of the things we should be doing is hugging value for money and arguably close as a left-wing idea. Because value for money should highlight the cost of non-investment in New Zealand. It's not just about investing and what's the value for money of that investment. If we choose not to invest, what are the costs of not investing? And what are the costs we're transferring onto the future and expecting somebody else to pay rather than just us paying right now? So we can work out the true opportunity cost. And finally, we want to commit to that long-term goal of increasing government expenditure as a proportion of GDP. New Zealand's expenditure as a portion of GDP for government is very low. It's historically low. And so we want to actually move that to a level of 35% of GDP by 2035. So that will put somewhere in the order of 6 to 8% of GDP more into the government coffers for investment, for health and education, for investment in the physical infrastructure that we need. It still actually wouldn't take us anywhere near the UK. It still actually wouldn't take us anywhere near our European comparators that we choose often to compare ourselves to. But it would lift ourselves systematically and make sure that we're doing so in a way where we're able to make sure we have the necessary finance available to actually deliver the goods and services that we think we want in New Zealand, that we want to be country A rather than country B. And so, this is our net debt position right now, 20%, and we're hugely below our comparators overseas. So, for us, the future is in front of us. We see things changing globally. We see things changing politically. We see the country changing and realizing that actually our responses to Cyclone Gabriel, our responses to natural disasters, our responses to other things are changing how we're viewing the necessity of government investment and the necessity of making sure that we're making sure our health, education, and other services are sustainable. The conversation is no longer about managing debt. The conversation is about how we invest well and how we, to use that terrible phrase, build back better. The future for us at the CTU is in front of us, but we've got to win it first. We've got to win and decide and deliver the plan that will deliver that country A first and move away from the plan that's currently delivering us country B. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is the government listening? What are we going to see in the budget? What's going to be done differently?
I wish I could tell you I knew what was going to be in the budget. I would make a lot of money if I did. I'd be breaking several laws. But in terms of what's going to be in the budget, that's a great question. The government has a choice in front of it. It can either choose to be a bit conservative. The Prime Minister has also talked about delivering bread and butter budgets, about delivering on bread and butter concerns. And it can say, we're just not going to do anything right now. We're just going to calm and be sensible and just deliver what's necessary right now. And we'll come back to those issues in the long run. To me, that would be a mistake. To me, actually, we can do that, but we need to set out that long-term plan, that long-term vision of actually how not only are we going to invest in the problems that we had before the natural disasters we had earlier this year, before COVID, before a whole bunch of other issues that are still here, and deliver the investment that's necessary on top to rebuild, and rebuild in a way where we're not just storing up problems again for the future, where we're not just simply putting houses back on land where it doesn't work, where we're not simply building large roads and large-scale roads to areas where actually we shouldn't be doing that, where we're building the industries of the future so that actually we're building the economy of the future and not just contributing to climate change, but also contributing to climate change in a way that actually isn't sustainable for employment terms in the future. Now, you can do all of that, and to me, that would provide the platform at the election for saying, here's the change, here's country A, here's what we want to be, and you've got a choice ahead of you as to how you deliver that. Now, I hope that's what the government's doing. As I say, I have no special insight for the benefit of the tape. But in terms of what is necessary to us, nothing, unless we deliver that, we're going to be still asking that question at the election, and we're still possibly going to be asking the question afterwards. And we will have spent a long period of time and wasted a long period of time to actually get there.
A couple of questions, you and then you.
Thank you so much for that talk. It was really illuminating. I don't know much about economics. My background is medicine. I'm a GP. I've got a couple of questions. With the OCR going up and interest rates rising, aren't the banks profiting hugely from that? And where does that money go? And secondly, in my work, I see a lot of illness from children and also adults who live in cold, mouldy houses. In fact, I think the Green Party said that there was an excess of something like, I think you'll probably know, Philippa, so many number of deaths, which actually tried to compare it to the road death toll. And I think the death rate from cold, mouldy houses is on a par, if not higher, but you probably know that better than I do. And just thirdly, in terms of your comment about mental health, I could provide, I've done some psychiatry training, although I'm not a psychiatrist, I could provide fantastic mental health care to so many of my patients if I didn't have to charge them. And I don't know what the solution is there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I too don't know a lot about economics, so that's there's two of us. But in terms of the first question, do banks profit when the interest rate goes up? Now, it would be fair to say this is a contested issue, because banks also borrow money to then pass on to you. So they're paying higher interest rates themselves. They're receiving higher interest rates on the deposits that they hold in other banks and other things. So generally speaking, it generally washes out of the system. The thing you've got to look at is a thing called the net interest margin. For banks, for those of you who are desperately following along at home, net interest margins, which is the gap between the rate they borrow at and the rate they pay out at. And that's elevated a little bit recently, but it's expected to go back down. So in the short run, yes, they've probably made a bit of money. In the long run, probably not any huge amount more money. And also, the range of defaults goes up when the interest rate goes up, and the range of bad loans goes up, so they've got a provision on that side. I don't want to be here to defend the banks when they're making record profits across the piece, but it's generally speaking not quite as straightforward as interest rates go up and then the banks make giant profits. They do in some places, but not elsewhere. In terms of those who are impacted by cold and mouldy housing,
9,500 children. In 2021, 9,500 children under 6 were hospitalised for illnesses due to cold, mouldy housing.
So 9,500 children, that's about a child an hour who ends up in hospital due to cold, mouldy housing, or meningitis from memory is the other one.
And once they go in once, they're more likely to go in twice, and
Yeah.
then they're more likely to die, and we have a high rate of infant deaths.
So again, this is a wealthy country. You know, we shouldn't be putting up with that range or on that level of of outcomes for children in that space. In exactly the same way as this is a wealthy country, but we have we have rheumatic fever levels that we shouldn't have. We have cold, mouldy houses that we shouldn't have. There is a way to stop it. It's called building better housing, and building more of it, and making sure that people can afford to heat their home. So they're not choosing between heating one room or heating many rooms or turning the light on or something else. So it's not inflation and other things in this matter aren't actually an issue if we're building the right number of housing, if we're making sure the houses don't leak, if they're actually insulating those homes. Not only are those households better off, we're actually tackling inflation in the long run because they're spending less on their energy bill, which means they're less impacted by movements in energy overall. It's one of the nice things that we can do where we can say we could tackle inflation both in the short run and in the long run with investment from the Crown.
Did you have a question?
Yes, thank you for that address. I'm very heartened by it because there's quite a lot of the ideas that I thought, yes, that's what they should be doing, and I'm not an economist. But if you're looking at the welfare of people and the welfare of the planet, but you're also looking at the welfare of the people, then that seems a lot of common sense stuff. And a lot of the things you've said about the electricity companies, all that, it's been going on for years, and people have been saying we must stop that and Huntley must be down. And then the question is, why doesn't it happen? And every time I talk along those lines, I'm told I'm a lefty and that the election won't go that way because Labour is too scared to lose to National. And so, you know, like there's always that sort of argument so that they always stay in the middle and don't want to upset voters that seem to be important. So how do we get around that? I mean, that's kind of like one of the things I've been thinking about. And I wish you would send this presentation to Grant Robertson, but he probably knows a lot of these things. But anyway, how do we get around that issue, you think?
You may well have heard me say them to him. I guess I actually don't think things like climate change are left-wing or right-wing ideas.
No,
I think they're both. The solutions I've proposed come from a place of progressive hope and the idea of a progressive economy. I hope that political parties of all persuasions would take up the idea of helping to turn off the last of our fossil fuel suppliers. But as I say, I actually don't think many of these problems are ideological in nature. They're actually just practical in nature. And actually the challenge is not do we need a solution? The challenge is how do we get to a solution? And how do we get to a solution that not only tackles our long run problems, but does so in an equitable way? And that's where I come from. Is that how do we tackle that problem in an equitable way so we're not loading the costs simply onto those who have the least ability to pay, or passing the costs onto those who simply work in that sector and now face highly invidious decisions on the other side, because what's good for the country may be terrible for an individual household because they suddenly lose their sole source of income. So it's about how it's not necessarily about whether it's left or right. It's about how we actually choose to get there. And for me, that's why the Just Transitions Partnerships are so important. It's why the Climate Change Commission's report is so important. It's why the Equitable Transition Strategy of the government is so important. Because actually, it's in making sure they're real and making sure they're actually delivered in a genuinely equitable way that actually will deliver outcomes that not only benefit New Zealand now, but benefit New Zealand in the long run, and actually tackle some of the exposure we have to future inflation. Because if energy prices globally move around, and we know that they do, the more that New Zealand's insulated from that particular problem, the less inflation we see moving around in the future.
Can I just add to that in terms of the houses? Is if you're buying a house and you talk to real estate agents, the houses are not more expensive or less expensive expensive, depending on whether they've got good insulation or not. It doesn't seem to make any difference. But at the moment, for example, we've just been in Holland. What they're doing with the housing there is they're giving them a rating from E, F, C, D, you know, all the way up. And if your house has got a better electricity and warming rating, then you can sell it for more money. But here you can still sell really damp houses with a very bad electricity, you know, efficiency rating, and they're almost the same price, because it just looks at what area it's in, how many bedrooms it's got. I mean, those sort of policies which would really help to get that electricity, that warming, because people be forced, if they want to sell their house for a better price, to do something about it. I mean, just...
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think one of the things we need to do in the very, very, very short run is just make sure we just have more houses. And we actually have more houses that are decently built, and that are warm and that are insulated, and actually, you know, that we can put our families in and they don't cause harm. Yeah. And for me, you know, again, if there's one of the key actions of government, if there's no other reason for the state to exist, it's how can we actually do that in a way which helps to reduce the level of harm that exists in our community.
There's a couple more questions. One here and one across here. I will keep moving.
Thanks very much. The talk's been great today, Craig and Diana. My question, why has the CTU ever thought of getting a political party together to challenge a sort of particular Labour that really seems to have lost their way? And question is, from what positive things have you seen from when you were overseas that could be implemented here and possibly could be?
I'm at pains to say that the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions is an unaffiliated body. It is not affiliated to any political party, and members are able to make their choices about which political party that they want to choose, both as trade unions and as individual members. So I wouldn't want to see the CTU involved with any political party, because we need to get on with all of them, because they will be in power at some point in time. And we need to work to ensure that workers are getting the best deal and that workers' rights are protected and that workers are, you know, looked after, regardless of who is in office. So I certainly wouldn't want to see the CTU getting into the politics game. One, I think that would be a bad idea, and two, there are already plenty of choices out there for people to make decisions in, and so they should do that as individuals rather than the CTU instructing them on how to do that. In terms of international examples of what this is the case, you know, again, you just look at the US, you look at the Biden Inflation Reduction Act. There's a whole suite of programs for the Biden Inflation Reduction Act, and as a whole, it's spending $1.4 trillion on new infrastructure in the US. If we look at Canada, the Trudeau government has recently instituted an early childhood education policy that will see ECE cost no more than $10 a week, $10 a day, wherever you are, across Canada. Now, in Quebec, it's currently around $500 a week for childcare. So you imagine the money that's putting back into the pockets of those who want childcare, who want to be able to use it but can't. And it's also creating the spaces for childcare in Canada along the same way. So there's a whole bunch of examples we can use from overseas and elsewhere, but you know, we're not short of examples and things that we can do in New Zealand right now. We know that we need to be spending more money on housing. We know we need to be spending more money on insulating housing. We know we have a car fleet that is amongst the dirtiest and oldest car fleet anywhere in the developed world. We know that we have the second most expensive ECE anywhere in the OECD. So there are plenty of things that we know where the problems are. The challenge is the political will to tackle them, and then providing the finances and the long-term plan to get there. So it's not just about short-term needs, it's about that long-term plan, and the long-term plan to turn around those problems in ways that not only tackle our short-term economic needs, but tackle our long-term economic needs as we go with them. I'm definitely in trouble now.
Yeah, you're right. Okay, you're staying out of the politics game, you say, but I guess the disappointment that I feel is that one looks to the union movement, if to any movement in New Zealand, for a left perspective. And by left, I mean something a lot more hard-nosed than we have here. This is carefully and very cautiously reasonable stuff, as if we're all in this together, chaps, and with a bit of conversation and some tripartite agreement, it'll all sort out. And that starts from a diagnosis there that just says, oh, somehow we've made some terrible mistakes. And that's how we came to be where we are now. And I don't think that's the case at all. We're on the receiving end of a class war that was won by the rich at the expense of the poor and workers. And frankly, I mean, looking at Ukraine, one sort of thinks once you've got something as ugly and as organised and as effective as the right wing and the rich offensive in New Zealand against the general interest over the last 30 years, you kind of sort of think, couldn't we get some F-16s and accurate rockets and stuff to sort of make a difference? And so I think that you see, you list all the right areas in some ways. I'm happy to the electricity, radio, I'm right in on that. You're only touching the sides with Huntley. The banks, I'm right in with that. Tax, I'm right in with that. But in each of those areas, you sort of go to the point of saying, oh, you know, how about this? Rather than get something really muscular and targeted. So I guess the challenge to you, thinking through this long-term plan, is that as the plan is developed, to actually do the diagnosis in each case. What exactly is wrong here, and who actually gains and who loses if we take a left perspective? And who loses is really important, because the guys who will lose from a more progressive set of politics are extremely well organised and extremely politically effective, and they're not going to sit down and have a reasonable conversation with you unless there is a really muscular movement of some sort up against them. And so, I mean, staying out of politics doesn't cut it for me, I'm afraid.
A couple of things. I'm not going to get into whether or not we should be sending F-16s to the Ukraine. We don't have any F-16s to start with, or any rockets, and that's probably a good thing. In the last time the government bought some aeroplanes, which was the P-8s, it cost $3.2 billion. So I'm not particularly keen to get into there. But it's also, I think this is the first time I've ever been called cautiously and carefully put together in terms of an economic argument. But I don't disagree with your diagnosis. I think that actually there is a case for political parties to put together a compelling story of the need for change. And to put together that compelling story of that need for change in a way that puts workers and families and communities at its heart and their needs at its heart, and to then work from there to then say, well, what's the long-term plan that's going to deliver their well-being, and how do we deliver their well-being in ways that maximise the economic benefit for New Zealand? And right now, we don't have that. Now, I'm not in the politics game for two reasons. One, I can't think of who would vote for me. And two, we have political parties. Our job as people, as politically engaged individuals in New Zealand, is to push whoever your political party is to help deliver on those goals. I actually don't think that the CTU establishing a political party or taking a political position will particularly help. But what we can do is work with those organisations to say, actually, we need to move you to where that is. And that's our job. That's my job. That's all of our jobs, is actually to say, how do we deliver that long-term plan through those parties? Because that's the best way in which we can make that real, in which we can actually make that actually happen in government. But again, I don't want. I'm certainly not here for the CTU to become a political organisation. We need to work with every political party that comes into that exists, because they will be in office, and we need to make sure that workers are looked after and represented, regardless of who's in office.
Can I just follow up briefly on that? I enjoyed. First of all, I very much enjoyed your remarks. I'm not entirely sure that what Jeff suggests is practical at all. But what I do think is that one part of the narrative that can shift is around climate. You know, recently we've had a hell of a shock, you know, with the floods and so on, but not too far ahead. There's a hell of a lot more shocks coming. And I think there's a lot of sort of semi-rationalized fear out there about climate. And I think there could be some, you know, a narrative developed which makes use of that fear, not in a manipulative way, but in a fair and honest way, saying, you know, we've had 1.1 degrees of warming, and this is what we get. We've got 1.5 coming up, whether we like it or not. That's what we get, you know. So, yeah, well, you know, there's just a lot of concern to be harnessed out there, and harnessing it to make policy change and explain the necessity for decarbonisation. And on the hope side, I mean, that's the negative side, if you like, but on the hope side, a lot of the policies for decarbonising the economy are actually ones around infrastructure, transport, housing, you know, better ways of farming and so on, which all offer quite positive ideas and hope. So I think, you know, harnessing those sort of changes gets you away from the sort of talk of the past and shifts the discourse to another sort of positive narrative.
Thank you. We're in violent agreement. Because for us at the CTU, this is why we care passionately about the idea of that, and in trade unions internationally do, about this idea of a just transition. It's actually not about being afraid of the future. The future's going to happen. Change is going to happen. You know, as I keep repeating to audiences, I'm the son of a coal miner from the northeast of England. The coal mines went. Yeah. The key thing was that change was going to happen. It's how the change occurred and the devastation it brought as that change, which wasn't inevitable. And so actually, how do we make the changes that we both agree need to happen, that actually could be beneficial for New Zealand, and do so in ways that are equitable, that actually deliver the kinds of change that we need to see, and do so in ways that deliver us a more resilient economy in the nicest possible way, not just where we're forcing resilience onto workers, but actually we're creating system resilience inside the system, where we're creating long-term, good, decent work, where we're doing so in ways that actually support communities and families, where we're not just creating growth through greater economic insecurity or fishering workplaces, but we're actually doing so in ways that actually create good long-term work in New Zealand. And New Zealand's in a great place for this. We already have a head start in terms of our energy systems right now. We already have a head start in terms of our food production systems right now. We actually need to take that head start and really run with it to deliver the kind of economy which can be not only a showcase for the rest of the world, but delivers that long-term sustainable growth, which actually we all want to see, but does so in a way that is equitable, that does so in a way that doesn't pass the costs of change just onto those who face the direct employment consequences, or doesn't pass the costs of change onto those who have the least ability to pay because they don't have the income or the means to escape that change.
Time for a couple more questions. You've been waiting.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you, Craig, for a very inspiring vision of the future. But I'd like to talk about how we can't entirely ignore the legacy of the past. And it's like the old Irish joke, if I was going to Castlereagh, I wouldn't leave from here. And the particular part of your story I'd question is the sanguine view of our low public debt, which is absolutely true, but you can't consider it in isolation to private sector and particularly household debt, which years of runaway house price inflation has pushed up. And the ratings agencies and the bond markets are very mindful of that. And so I think there is a constraint there that you can't just ignore. I mean, I'm reminded of James Carville saying if he was born again, he'd like to come back as the bond market, because then you scare everybody. And I'm sure Liz Truss would understand the point. So I think there is a little bit more of a legacy debt constraint than your story suggests, don't you?
You're not wrong. You can't simply borrow your way to prosperity on that basis. You can't simply say, great, we have less debt than lots of other countries, we should just borrow up to their level and then take all that money and spend it. One, we probably couldn't deliver the stuff that we needed to, even if we borrowed all of that money. We need a plan to get there. We need the capacity to get there, and we should be investing in as much in getting the capacity to deliver things as much as the things that we need. But two, we need to be increasing the level of revenue that the Crown is actually generating. This is not just simply about us going to the bond markets, and there's a bond issuance today if anybody wants to go and find out. $3 billion is being syndicated, but it's not just about going to the bond markets and saying, can I have some money, thank you very much. It's about changing it so sustainably we're delivering the level of goods and services we need to as a country from the public sector, in doing so in a way that actually isn't trying to trade off one service versus another because we never have enough money. It's about actually lifting that level of revenue, which is why we talked at the end about lifting the level of government expenditure as a percentage of GDP up to 35%. That again wouldn't get us, that wouldn't touch the sides, to use your phrase earlier, about the ability to, in comparison to our European colleagues or even the US or elsewhere, but it would put 6 to 8% more GDP into government hands, which would then transform our ability to actually deliver some of the goods and services that we need to do so. And finally, I think this is a problem of information as much as it is a problem of expenditure. We actually don't know how much we need to spend. We actually have vanishingly little idea of how much we need to spend on things. In 2015, the Treasury used to produce 2 lines inside, and for those of you who are desperately following along at home, the fiscal strategy model of the Treasury. And there's 2 lines were the level of health expenditure needed to continue health, demographic and other changes, and the level of education expenditure needed to maintain for health, demographic and other changes. And we projected that into the future, right up until 2015, when it disappeared. And so we now no longer know how much we need to be spending on that basis. That information no longer exists. So we need to put that information back into the public domain. Because actually I think one of the things that New Zealanders want to do is they want a decent set of public services, but they want to be able to make that choice. So if we're choosing between a tax cut or we're choosing between government investment, we're actually making an active and informed choice, not a choice where these things can be done and it doesn't impact our public services because we never know the cost on the other side.
I'd like to congratulate you both too and the CTU for what I think is a very good, usable set of policies and document. I'd just like to make one of the things that I think, having lived through the experiment of New Zealand experiment of the last 30 years, the first thing that was deconstructed to set us on the path we've lived through unhappily in lots of ways was the notion of planning. And I hear you every time you speak, the plan is emphasized, but I do think you need to win the argument actually as to why having a plan is a good idea, because that argument's been killed off over many years. And it sounds simple, but I would just suggest adding to the narrative why planning is a good thing to do, because it implies completion and actually, and delivery and all those good things. Whereas we talk about policies and that kind of stuff, and they don't have that completion component. So just a suggestion that taking on the issue of why a plan is a good idea needs to be a sort of a preliminary argument, I think.
Thank you. I'll slip you the money later for the compliment at the beginning. But you're not wrong. One of the things that we've done systematically is make all of these problems somebody else's problem. So if it talks about how many houses we're going to build, that's somebody else's problem. If we talk about delivering services, that's somebody else's problem. The future will solve these problems, and future me is more handsome and capable than current me. And so they will then deliver on these issues. Whereas instead, we never outline actually, well, we now know, or we think we know to the best of our ability, what's needed and how are we actually practically going to deliver that. Because without it, the future can always do it. And we never have to worry about those things. Whereas in reality, we do. And we have to have a very adult conversation about actually how much we want to choose to have in particular areas. Yeah, absolutely. And for us at the CTU, it's the absence of that planning. It's that absence of what good looks like. It's the absence of the star on the hill that we're all trying to head towards. Because if we can get broad agreement as to what that good looks like, what that star on the hill looks like, then, you know, the pathway to get there can vary between political parties. The pathway can get there vary between different times and time periods, but we all know we're heading in that direction. And that's what we miss right now, is that sense of what good looks like and going from there, because then we can all invest in that direction and we can choose how close we want to get to that good place right now.
We're running out of time, but Philippa, one last question.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed your talk, and I've been sitting here thinking. One of the problems, well, first of all, we haven't mentioned Māori at all. That's not to say a problem. I'm thinking about treaty obligations, and if you go around, as you and probably I both do, to different iwi and different rohi and so forth, they have very clear ideas about what they want to do with their own land. And whether it's improved upon or as a tūranga waiwai. So that I don't think that you have to get that back into your debate. And also, it's this, somehow we can't collaborate very well. I'm not talking about co-governance here, I'm just talking about the states. So we have housing, which what is slowing it down is the infrastructure, which is absolutely appalling almost everywhere. And if we're going to continue as the previous government did, building on top of asbestos and lead and all those kind of things, it's easy to plonk houses down, but not to have them with proper broadband and so that there are 3 water services and all those kind of things. So I think that's a really big problem, and that we still haven't worked out this relationship between local governments who say we can't do anything because we're out of money. So there are some things that we just don't seem to be collaborating well, and I'm a great supporter of the wellbeing framework, and I thought, well, that was going to make it easy for people to see that there are co-benefits if we all work together and we collaborate. You know, people stay in hospital because there's no houses for them to go to. I went to Rolliston Prison when I was visiting the other day. People are stuck there on remand and bail because there's no houses for them to go to. And so they're actually building housing there as a sort of apprenticeships, which this government is pushing hard. They get paid 6p an hour, which is interesting. But I mean, we still haven't dealt with our terrible history of prisons. We still haven't dealt with our terrible prison of all these children in state care and have 15 times the suicide rate of others. So we have some terrible legacy issues here. We're keen to look at them in other countries, but we have some pretty nasty ones here. And in a sense, we don't face that very well. So I appreciate your frankness tonight and all the other really interesting questions. I'm not wanting to put F-16 fighters anywhere, but I do think there are things we have to think about very seriously at both the local council and central government level. And if we can't do it here, where can they do it?
Thank you. Once again, we don't disagree. We're in violent agreement. The challenge I put it is like this, is that there are many bits of government where, because there are many bits of government in charge, no one's in charge. So we have, climate change is a great example. We have 16 different ministers who have some responsibility for climate change. In reality, that means no one's in charge of climate change. In terms of housing, we have a housing minister, we have a housing minister for infrastructure, we have a minister who has responsibility for building materials, so on, and so forth. That means no one's in charge.
And in Finland, they have one central agency that manages all the parts, and that's the only country that's really got rid of homelessness.
And so, we can point to many examples overseas of where this is done much better. But where it's done much better, it's done for that much more coordinated approach, which actually puts the problem at the centre rather than the minister. So how do we tackle homelessness? How do we tackle poor housing? How do we tackle health outcomes as a consequence of poor housing? And we put that at the centre, we put that problem at the centre, and then we put solutions around it to deliver that, rather than start with the ministry or start with the administration and then say, okay, how can that ministry or administration then tackle that problem?
7 people now funding separate pots of money for housing. So I'm not sure that that's
So again, so that's because we haven't defined the problem, because we've got 7 different pots of money chasing 5 different ministries in 5 different places. And actually the problem is we don't have enough houses, and the houses that we do have don't work. Sing it, brother. So for us, you know, that's why we came here tonight, is to talk about the need to have that long-term plan, to have that idea of what good looks like as a country, as an economy, because the economy should be about delivering a good country rather than the other way around. And in getting there, what are the outcomes that we want to see for families, for communities, for individuals, that actually put them at the heart of that, lift their well-being, and actually then work from there. And using that idea of that long-term plan to then say, if we're going to do that, what then needs to change? And what are the things that need to change in order to make sure we can do that sustainably? So we're not just radically shifting from one view to another view every 3 or every so years. We've got a long-term plan, and we can move towards that over the long run.
I've got a feeling we could go for another couple of hours, but thank you very much. Thank you for the work you've done. I mean, I think that's a tremendous presentation, and I hope it goes around the country, and I hope and people people listen, people take note. But could you join me now in thanking Craig and Diana very much indeed?